Hello, hello. Good afternoon, morning, depends on where you are right now. And we are so thrilled to have David Niguidula with us. He's talking to us about the power of digital portfolios in a way that it can actually help students imagine possibilities, to actually think through the collection and creation of artifacts, and graduate with a resume of accomplishments as part of their pre-K through 12 learning experience. He wrote a fabulous book, which we will give a quick snippet to and shout out on our landing page right underneath this interview. And welcome, good morning, David.
Hi, Allison and Benna. So great to be with you. Thanks for taking the time to chat about this stuff, or as we say, continue our ongoing conversation around all these issues.
So David, how many decades have you been working on portfolios? Because this is not a new thing for you.
No, it started I was with an organization called the Coalition of Essential Schools. And the very first draft we did of this work was in 1992, which in technology days is forever ago. Most schools at the time were trying to be convinced that email wasn't a fad. And this predates, at the time the big thing was, wiring the schools to the internet. What is this sort of thing? So we actually did first versions in HyperStudio, HyperCard, if anyone remembers that. Yeah, it's been a while.
So one of the things that was really intriguing in the opening chapter of your book was the distinction that you were making between this being a tech initiative versus a personalized learning or assessment initiative. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Sure. When people hear the term digital portfolios, we really would like the emphasis to be on the portfolio rather than the digital. It's possible we've seen this in some schools, that when the focus is on, well, let's get the kids online and let's focus on what technology can do and put all these things together, essentially it's very easy to fall into just having electronic file cabinets. We've got all our stuff stored in one place. When the real power of the portfolios is by bringing conversations around what kids are knowing and be able to do, students reflecting on their work. And so it really needs to be driven from the curriculum and assessment side of what schools are trying to do.
I suppose I would just add on to that, David, having worked with you for many, many years, I know you believe this, which is what's critical to the whole enterprise is self-discovery, which is not just what teachers advocate that they collect, but what they in fact choose and how that reflects who they are.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a way of students getting out of their immediate, we all get into this in the daily life of schools. We have this one, this assignment's due today, I need to get this in. Taking a step back and looking at the progress I've made, looking at the growth over time, looking at what I've been able to achieve now that I couldn't do in the past. That's all critical, and the conversation with the faculty about feedback is absolutely at the heart of what makes a portfolio system work well. When it's driven by the tech, we've seen that the systems, the initiatives just don't last as long.
So when you're thinking about starting with the end in mind and how schools and districts have been using this, in terms of thinking through this, not at a classroom level, but at a systematic level, what is it that you guide schools and districts to create in terms of starting with the end in mind?
So it's a question that comes up a lot. What do we want as graduates to know and be able to do? What are the skills and knowledge and habits or dispositions that we think every student, and when I say graduation, that doesn't have to mean 12th grade. It could be you're leaving middle school, elementary, whatever level you're thinking about. But by the end of our work together, where do we want, what are the qualities that we expect students to have? So that should be the driving force behind this. And part of what we're trying to get away from is the notion of accumulating credits as your only mechanism of showing accomplishments. Now let's We want students to be able to have content knowledge. So what math do they know? Can they do things in history? But what are the skills that they have? Can they problem solve? And then we get into the things that aren't inherently academic, but are obviously critical to schooling. The habits of mind, obviously, is something that is very important. Can they think about their thinking in order to be able to solve problems? Can they work independently? Can they work in a group? That collection, what ASCD is referred to as the whole child initiatives, and that's what we need to be able to think about. By thinking in that way, we tend to get away from the lowest level standard types of things. We want to be able to show students are problem solving. Do we care specifically about a certain geometry proof? We want to be able to get at the things that they can transfer as they go on. Mm-hmm. So that's what we're trying to do with the end in mind. Can schools think in that big picture? Think of the overall endeavors of what they're trying to get to. And it ties back often to other things. If they've been doing a lot of work around understanding by design or looking at those kinds of approaches to their curriculum and assessment, that can help a great deal.
So when you're thinking about this, then how long does it typically take a school or a district to articulate I'm going to loosely say handful. You can't have a list of 125 indicators, but if you're trying to get consensus on what's most significant, typically how long do you see that time window?
It's a matter of conversations. And, the schools we've seen will do their first draft. And like you said, the first draft will often be far too long. What do we think is important? And we will list everything in the world. And then we start to narrow it down. So like, what would you really say, a student must have in order to graduate? Or vice versa, what are the things that we would say if the student didn't have, we wouldn't feel comfortable letting the student exit? It starts to narrow things down. I would say, up here in New England, a lot of schools go through something in accreditation where they're creating the term now as a portrait of a graduate.
Yeah.
And these conversations often take place, I would say, at least, a semester, sometimes a year, depending how much time you have. But you need a lot of input into that. A lot of stakeholders need to say what they need. And getting the language right is sometimes it's often tricky. But I think that folks can narrow on fairly quickly into the big, broad categories.
Yeah. Benna, I was thinking that it's also lining up with our definition of personalized learning. So the last part of personalized learning, our definition, is talking about demonstrating desired outcomes. And what's really interesting is it's not just the outcomes that the state sets or the nation sets or the ministry sets or even the local school district sets, but it's also connected to the desired outcomes that the student has in relation to their own aspirations. And so I think it's a beautiful way of engaging in that interplay between something that's school-driven and something that's learner-driven.
I think also, and I guess I was listening carefully to what you were saying, David, and I think that it's important to recognize that it's a balanced approach. It's not the only approach to assessment. If you ask the portfolio to showcase everything, then that's where you get into all kinds of problems. Whereas if you really narrow the focus in such a way that you're saying, what can the portfolio show us that we can't see in other instances? If we just have a series of test scores, for example, that's quantitatively easy to see, and we can understand where growth is because you did better in one than in the last. But it's really hard to get the texture of what you see when a student is really doing something like looking at a very advanced and challenging problem, how they behave, what their process is, which is you're talking about the habits of mind, and also what they do to stay with it and how they then eventually showcase and demonstrate some of the skills that they've learned to solve this. And I think also you've said, and I know that you believe, that every entry to the portfolio is not necessarily your so-called best work. Sometimes it's an example of something that you've really tried to be innovative with and perhaps didn't do what you wanted it to do. I mean, if you could just talk a little bit about that balance, I think that's an important aspect for people to recognize. The portfolio doesn't need to be everything. So how do you get more selective about it?
Absolutely. So let's take a specific example, something we've seen play out in math. We've got math tests that give some general sense of knowledge, but many schools have found, just purely if they look at their test scores, that their the problem-solving skills, the ability to handle word problems or story problems, usually falls further back than students' overall ability to compute or handle the algorithms of math. So a portfolio can focus then on that problem-solving skill. So one teacher we saw had the kids save a word problem every week, put it in a folder, and then at certain points, they got in front of a video camera and said, here's a problem that I'm going to show you how I solve it. And they talk about, what's the strategy that they use? Can they retell the problem? Can they work through the actual math? And in that instance, it's less important whether the particular math is about fractions or money problem or a certain kind of missing element of an algebra piece. The idea of showing, here is how I've solved the problem. Here is how I can apply a certain strategy. That shows something that would be very hard to pull out of a test. And sometimes, also, there are things that just aren't that don't test well. Every school has, in English, elements of reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Nobody has a standardized test for listening and speaking.
Yes, right.
So we all agree this is important. So how can we demonstrate that? How can students do that? That becomes a very good portfolio candidate to be able to see somebody, listening or speaking in various contexts over time.
And the ones that you're naming are the ones that I think most often show up as the profile of the graduate.
Yes.
How are your communication skills? Are you able to do problem solving? So it's just a different pathway to demonstrating. Go ahead, Allison, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, it was such an important point that you raised, that it's not supposed to be the only assessment metric that you now all of a sudden use, but it's a balanced approach. And David, I think the rich examples that you gave from problem-solving example to the speaking and listening example, I think are significant. So as we're starting to move into the idea when it's now at the classroom level, where teachers then would need to figure out or identify what are portfolio-worthy tasks. So if you can talk a little bit about that in terms of what you've seen over the years, as well as any insight on how it affects the process, the level of engagement or focus students are doing because they know it's potentially sort of designated as portfolio worthy.
So when we start with most schools, and those of you teachers who are listening to this, if you think about your year-long class, we aren't talking about everything needs to go into the portfolio. So start with 3, 4, 5 tasks that you give right now, that you would say, here's evidence that students produce as part of this task that would be strong candidates for the portfolio. If you think about what's the most memorable things, what are the things that kids walk away with, there's usually some common elements to that. They're usually things that require some kind of effort. It's not something that kids can just easily write off. Kids often equate effort with quality, and that's true often, not 100%, but it's something to say, like, if they've had to earn it, they have to work. If it's something that gets at the expectations, clearly demonstrates the standards, that's another element of it. Another piece is that it produces something that kids are proud of and that teachers are proud of. We will go to portfolio reviews at the end of the year, And it isn't uncommon for many kids to be referring to the same project. It's like, oh, we did this fabulous magazine project in social studies, and half the class will say, you know, this is the one that I want to show. That's telling you that there's something about that task that both students and teachers can feel good about as their best demonstration. So most teachers, I would say, have these kinds of pieces in their repertoire. They are things that they're offering now. So it doesn't mean we're starting from scratch with entirely new tasks. But it is the kind of task where you can say, now, let's look at these and let's make sure that if other people are looking at them, you know, that if we're going to make this into a portfolio-worthy task, we want this to be good evidence that potential other readers could see. Are there things we need to do to solidify that task and make that, you know, truly something that is sound as an assessment and also engaging and critically, you know, the things that offer, you know, again, when we go back to personalization, the idea of student choice. Jay McTighe was just talking, I heard him talk the other day about task frames, the idea of having some kind of assessment that you can, where, for example, you're an expert on saying to the students, you are an expert on something and your task is to provide instructions on how to do that thing. And providing that is sometimes a very useful way to, for you as teachers to think about what are the tasks that I'm offering that can really enhance students, when we look at the student side of it, really get to know the students at a better level.
Yeah.
You know, it's really interesting because I think what you're saying is critically important in terms of you always talk about the conversation. And the conversation is really the co-creation. And the co-creation is really that of what the teacher feels is important for you to show and what you feel is important for you to show, and how you begin to co-create a demonstration that has more meaning. And I think sometimes we mistake it by saying, here's what the standard says, you need to show something for the standard, instead of you need to show something that demonstrates who you are as a learner and what you can do. Again and again, I see that the abstraction of the standards often is not the best place to start the conversation. So when you're talking about, we look at some work together and we ask the question, is it portfolio worthy? I think that's a conversation that you can have with students that would really bring to the fore what we mean when we say we want to have something in the portfolio that showcases or demonstrates something. It's really that continual reciprocity between the teacher's agenda, the district's agenda, the standards agenda, and the student's agenda, and how you really facilitate over time.
And Ben, I mean, you're spot on. And I think one of the aspects of the book that David wrote is really around the not only co-creation that the teacher and the student are engaged in, but also the supplementation of other artifacts that are happening potentially well outside of the school territory, whether it's a part-time job or a summer internship or an investigation or creation that the students are doing on their own that may also give another dimension, reveal, again, back to that portrait of the graduate in a way that is more deep and meaningful sometimes than something that they're doing as an assignment in class. So it does add a different lens to that balanced approach of how can we see our learners 24/7, what artifacts are they proud of, and how can we make that part of the demonstration rather than it being a sideline.
Definitely. The best piece of writing may well have come from outside of English class. Maybe it was in science class. Maybe it was something I did for a community group. Maybe it was something, increasingly kids are taking credits in alternative settings. So after school environments or online types of things. So, just even the fact, here's something I wrote for myself and I just shared with some friends in a social media platform. Maybe that was my best piece of writing for the year. So yes, absolutely. Looking at that whole child means the entire set of experiences, and hopefully that's what this provides the opportunity for students to represent.
Well, thank you, David, for giving us a window into the book and the work that you've been doing for many decades. Again, 1992 is a very different time and space, but at the same time, the timelessness of what you just wrote. So if you're interested, it's called Demonstrating Student Mastery with Digital Badges and Portfolios. We'll create the link on the bottom of the page. And thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you, David.
Thank you all.